I enjoyed going back into the history of this thing tremendously myself personally. And it came to mind that, and I'm sure you all will relate to this, that life is nothing but a series of circumstances, evolving circumstances. This happens, guides you in that direction. You plan for this, but something happens and you go in another direction. And it's quite by accident that I got into what turned out to be at least one of the most significant, dramatic set of political circumstances of the 20th century, national politics, maybe in all of American history, because no other president has done what Richard Nixon did. I usually, excuse me, I usually end up the presentation with what I'm going to do first this time, two things. And this is the first one, if my electronic capabilities will sustain us.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
That was a dramatic episode in the history of our country. It's about a 15-minute speech. It was on television, and I'm sure some of you all saw it. If you ever want to listen to the whole thing, just let me know, and I'll give you this little device here. I say that's sort of the termination of what I became involved in quite by accident. And I'm going to tell you about the accidents and the circumstances in just a moment. The other thing I had reserved for the ending, I'd really like to tell you about it first, because it's something that happened maybe 20 years after the President of the United States resigned. And it's significant. I really impress it upon young lawyers when I talk to them about the Watergate matter. And it's something that happened in 1985 in the U.S. Supreme Court, when the Cold War had warmed up a little bit and Russia and the United States were on better terms. A group of Russian justices visited our Supreme Court. Back in the back of the Supreme Court building in Washington, there's a chamber where just the justices meet and talk about and make their decisions. The Russian judges were back in that chamber with some of our justices, and one of the Russian judges, through an interpreter, said, "What do you all think was the most important case ever decided in this room?" Justice Souter responded, through an interpreter, of course, and said, "Well, I guess I would have to say that it was really Brown versus the Board of Education." That, as you will recall, was the segregation case, the separate but equal case. And Justice Souter said it resolved a very serious national social problem. But on top of that, it overruled an existing precedent. Plessy against Ferguson was a separate but equal decision that was decided back in the late 1800s. And he said, for those two reasons, I'd have to say Brown versus Board of Education. Souter says he noticed the Russian judge was kind of looking down, nodding his head, and Justice Souter said, "Well, Judge, what do you think? You seem to know something about American jurisprudence. What do you think was the most important case we ever decided?" The Russian justice said, "There's no doubt in my mind, Your Honor, it was the United States versus Nixon, the tapes case." And Justice Souter, a quizzical look on his face, and the Russian justice said, "That case decided that in the strongest nation on the face of the earth, with respect and reference to the strongest leader on the face of the earth, the rule of law prevails." That is a significant comment to come from a Russian justice, and that's why I tell all of my young lawyer friends that the rule of law does prevail in this country, and we should be proud of it. What happened, what was going on in June of 1972 up in Washington, D.C.? It was a tough political campaign, interesting one. McGovern against Nixon, and Eagleton had psychiatric disclosure of psychiatric problems. He dropped out, and Ted Kennedy's brother-in-law took his place, and there was a lot going on. It was an interesting era of politics. Nixon had been in office. There'd been a lot of conflict. that had been the Ellsberg papers, the Pentagon papers. You remember where there was a break-in at Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, and there was a lot of conflict between the political parties and the people who were running the political parties at the top. It was a pretty mean world back then, as it is still to some extent. The conflict resulted in a scheme on behalf that was instigated by some members of the Nixon group, mainly some people that were associated with what was called CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. The Republican group was referred to as CREEP. Even the CREEP people referred to themselves as the CREEP organization. And on the night of June the 16th, going into June the 17th, up in D.C., there was an unusual set of circumstances that occurred. A very unusual set. The break-in was planned. What went on was planned, but what happened and how it was revealed was the first of the things that struck me as being quite unusual and quite interesting, and that is the burglars who were caught in the Watergate. That was not the first time they'd been inside the building late at night after hours, and they were very cautious because on the second time they went in, and not many people know all this history is rather detailed, but it's interesting, I think. They locked themselves in by mistake. So when they went back on this night of June the 16th, early in the morning of June the 17th, about 2 o'clock in the morning, they put a piece of tape on the door of one of the areas they were breaking into to either plant bugs or get private material of the Democrat National Convention. And they put a piece of duct tape on the door, just a piece of duct tape. One little circumstance of that they did to protect themselves against what they thought would be getting caught. The janitor, the night watchman, Fred Wills, came by. He saw it and thought it was rather unusual, so he pulled the piece of tape off the door and thought maybe the janitorial crew had put it on there. And so he went about his business, and then about an hour later he came back. It was the circumstance of that piece of tape being taken off the door was a circumstance. The real circumstance was he put another piece of tape on the door. He saw another piece of tape on the door and took it off, I'm sorry. And when he took he figured the night watchman had put the first piece of tape on there, so he took it off. He put another piece of tape on there. When he came, the burglars did, and then when Fred came back the second time, he saw that piece of tape was gone, and he called the Washington police. If it had not been for tape number one, the burglars put on and Wills removed it. If it had not been for tape number two, President Nixon might well have served out his term of office. That is just one example of circumstances that change people's lives and that even go to the point of there being a resignation of the President of the United States 15, 18 months later. The other thing that was going on in Raleigh, and you'll relate to this, was just a plain guy doing a job with children getting ready to go to college, trying to make a living. I had my first law partner, Dr. Beverly Lake, had gone on the Supreme Court. His partner, A.J. Fletcher, they gave me my first job. I always remember, and you always remember the guys that give you their first job. Mr. Fletcher started Channel 5, and Bev Jr., who's with us here today, he came in. I finished law school a couple years later. He came in with us, and he decided to go with the Attorney General and with Robert Morgan in the Attorney General's office. And I was there with a couple of other lawyers minding my own business. And I had some dealings with a fellow you all might know or know of named Ike Andrews from Siler City. Ike was a friend of mine. I helped him in some trial work from time to time. He came by the office. He was in the legislature. He said, Gene, I decided I'm going to run for Congress. Well, that was quite a circumstance. And I said, well, that's wonderful, Ike. I think you'll make a good congressman. I'm glad you're going to do that. He said, well, I need you to be my campaign manager. I said, well, what? I said, I was dabbled, but I had not done anything of that serious nature. He said, no, you got to do it. I said, I don't know how to manage a campaign. He said, well, it's like this. In my district, there are more voters in Wake County than any of the other 4 or 5 counties in my district. And all I need is a name that's associated as a resident of Wake County. So I said, well, I guess I qualify. So I agreed, kind of in name only, because I didn't know what I was doing, to be Ike's campaign manager. Now, that was a circumstance, wasn't it? Just while they were breaking in the Watergate up in D.C., Ike asked me to be his name-only campaign manager. So I did, and we ran against a fellow now, a good friend of mine, Jack Hawk, was a Republican candidate. And we went through the campaign and stumbled through the campaign and won by 800 votes. We won by 800 votes. Ike won, and the 800 votes that did help Ike win, a number of them came from Durham County. Ike came in, I said, congratulations, Mr. Congressman, I'm so glad you won. He said, well, gee, we have a problem. I said, we do? He said, yeah, Jack has sued us in federal court over and is contesting the election. Another circumstance. Jack decided to, he claimed there were fraud in Durham County. Can you imagine fraud in Durham County? Amazing claim. But anyway, Ike said, yeah, he said, you got to represent me. We were before Frank Dupree, a Republican judge. The plaintiff losing candidate was a Republican, and Ike, and I at that time was on the Democrat side of the picture. He said, yeah, you got to represent me. So I at least that circumstance put me in the place where I sort of knew what I was doing, going to court. And so we went into court in November, mid-November, and had a hearing. Judge Dupree took it under advisement. Ike didn't know whether he was going to be a congressman that year, the next year, or however long litigation takes, which sometimes is quite a long time. But on December the 27th, I got a call from the courthouse. Judge Dupree ruled in my favor, in Ike's favor, our favor. And I called Ike. I said, well, congratulations, Ike. We won. You are going to be a congressman. He said, well, that's wonderful, Gene. I appreciate all your help. But you got to do one more thing for me. I said, what, one more thing? He said, yeah, you got to go to Washington with me. I don't have a staff. I didn't know whether the case was going to be over or not, and I got to have somebody go up there with me and help me formulate and hire my staff. Said, I got to hit the House floor running. That's another circumstance. So I went home and talked to Pat and the children and my partners and said, Ike wants me to do that, blah, blah, blah. And I ended up, I said, okay, I've got 2 months, 2 months. And she said, you can live with me. I've got an apartment up there, and you can commute back and forth on weekends, but you got to help me set up. So I said, okay. Well, I went to Washington. I thought that would be the end of it. I set up his staff. Galifianakis had run for the Senate, and a lot of Galifianakis people were handy and ready to be reemployed, and I met with him and interviewed and set up his staff, and he hit the floor running. In Washington in January and February, the lobbyists are all over the place, one cocktail party after another. And of course, Ike and I, being new congressmen, we attended quite many of them, and I kept running into Senator Irvin. He wasn't that big on cocktail parties, but Rufus Edmonston is one of his first senators. Rufus, to this day, including last night, has not missed a cocktail party. Kept running into Rufus, and that was time in January when they had the criminal trial, and the burglars, the 7 of them, the 5 who broke in, plus Liddy and Hunt, who were over in the hotel next door, keeping a lookout for the police to be able to warn the burglars, and they had their little electronic equipment, but they had a microphone like a chapstick. And that was confiscated and part of the trial evidence later on. But Hunt and Liddy were also caught and convicted. And you've probably seen Gordon Liddy on television now, advertising gold. I just love it when Gordon says, the greatest thing I ever did, the smartest thing I ever did in my life was to buy gold. And I can't help but think, well, Gordon, what was the dumbest thing you ever did? And that was Gordon and CIA and Howard Hunt, FBI guy, retired ex-FBI guy, were over in the motel keeping a lookout. Another circumstances, when the night watchman called the police and warned them, there were no uniformed police in the neighborhood. There was no marked police cars. The closest car was an unmarked car with unmarked police in it. So Hunt and Liddy never had anything to warn their buddies over the burglars about. Pure circumstance, again. But going back to the lobbyist in January, the criminal trial had taken place. They had been convicted. One of the convicted members, Magruder, you may remember, it was time in a criminal case, and this is a little something I know about, when some people get in trouble, all of a sudden they're ready to talk. So Magruder was ready to talk. He wrote a letter and gave some very strong information that the White House was very much knowledgeable about the break-in, if not before, at least afterward. And as you know, the cover-up was the ultimate big problem that Nixon faced. And as a result of that, the interest in Washington was overwhelming. The committee had been set up, and I was not on it originally, but they started running into problems. Two main problems was, number one, they'd been investigating for 4 or 5 weeks, and the investigative team then were making their reports on little 3x5 index cards, and they would put down the date, the name of the witness, who was involved, a summary, and just details. And those index cards were piling up. I mean, just one interview, one witness, one phone call, one piece of evidence after another was just pouring in. And the ultimate result of a congressional investigation ultimately is to print a report with a view toward there being corrective legislation to whatever the committee reports has been a mistake and that the laws should be changed. It was a final report. And we knew that there's no way in the world that the final report could be repaired with a stack of 3x5 index cards. And quite by coincidence, I had befriended some guys over at the Library of Congress, and we were having lunch. And just on an offhand remark, I said something about, you know, these 3x5 index cards are driving the committee crazy. And Rufus and Senator had asked me to help them on some of these little problems. This is the way I got into it initially. And they said, well, we are converting our card catalog at the Library of Congress onto a computer. This is 1973. I said, a what? They said, a computer. I said, oh, a computer. What does that mean? They said, well, we're taking the 3x5 index cards at the library, and our ladies are data processing them and put them into the computer. And when with the name of the book, the author, the name of the publisher, a summary of what the book's about, the main characters in the book, it just struck me, well, that's exactly what Senator Ervin needs. I said, can you show me that thing? I said, yeah. So we went over to the Library of Congress, walked down a long hall. At the end of the hall, opened the door, and there was an IBM computer in a place about that big, stacked up with lights flashing on and off. That was a computer. I asked them why they didn't buy a laptop, but they didn't understand what I was talking about. And I said, how do you, well, we have ladies come in at 8 o'clock in the morning, they work till 4 o'clock, then we have a second crew comes in at 4 o'clock, works till midnight. And I said, we're trying to get this done as quickly as we can. I said, well, what do you do with that computer thing at midnight? I said, well, no, it just sits here. I said, would you all lend us, the committee, that computer? And they said, oh yeah, they were everybody in Washington was interested in the whole event by then because it was such a dramatic situation. So we set up the computer, putting our investigative information into the computer. The next thing they needed, and the circumstance that got me over to the Senate side with Senator Ervin and Rufus was they had a court reporter. They decided to go on television. They had a secret meeting, a 5-hour meeting. Magruder disclosed a lot of inside information. It leaked out like a dam overflowing to the press. And so Senator Ervin said, and Senator Baker said, from now on we're going to have public hearings, no more private hearings. We're going public with this whole thing. And so when it went on, cranked up for public consumption, they had court reporters. And the lawyers they had before had not done a lot of trial work and been involved in the sort of thing that I'd messed with for so long at that time and still. I set up a court reporting system where we rotated the court reporters. One would start off in the morning an hour, then that reporter would retire, another one would come in, and that one would type up the transcript, and then every hour we'd rotate so that I had the report of the morning session on the senator's desk by 5 o'clock and the afternoon session on the senator's desk by 9 o'clock the next morning. That was just the circumstances that they just hadn't covered it, and I was able to help them in that regard. So they didn't fire me, they let me stay on a while. And I had my own investigative team. There again, purely by circumstance with the investigative group that I had. And we had 4 teams, and of the 4 teams, there was a majority counsel. I was a majority counsel. Had a minority counsel from Senator Baker's side, and had an staff investigator, and then we had a stenographer who took down the information from the witness at each of the interviews. We had an interview list, and it was quite coincidental, quite by accident, pure chance that you all have experienced in your life, that Alexander Butterfield happened to be on my list. Washington was and the country was so interested in politics with 99 days of television. And some of the ladies up at the Forum Blowing Rock, when I talked with them, one of them commented to me, said, "I remember it well. I was home. My children were school age then. I was home, not school age, not yet in school. I was at home," and said, "I was so upset that my soap operas were preempted with all that political stuff," and said, "But you know, I watched a day or two of it and said I didn't want to see any more soap operas. I got so carried away with it. It was so dramatic, and just the politics can be attractive." For some reason, remind this latest definition I've heard: politicians are like diapers. Have you heard that one? They need to be changed often, and for the same reason. And that also brought to mind, maybe some of you haven't heard the latest limerick about politicians. There once was a congressman named Wiener who had a perverted demeanor. And just like Bill, he got kicked from the hill. And now Congress is one Wiener leaner. That is a favorite of mine. And I got to think about politicians, how it never changes, all those terrible things that went on during the early 70s. It's still the same, and I thought, you know, what have we learned from Watergate? What have we learned from political people breaking into the private offices of other political people? And both parties were guilty of these things to one extent or another. And I opened my little book to review why maybe my thinking was not correct about Watergate having taught people a lesson. And just for curiosity, I started jotting down some of the things that have happened in our recent era. And I came out with politicians who should have been changed, but were not, and went to jail. A U.S. congressman, a Secretary of Agriculture, a Speaker of the House, North Carolina representative, U.S. attorney, a whole bunch of lobbyists, General Assembly aide, and getting on up to modern times, a governor, a little governor, a U.S. senator. So not much has changed. Maybe the acts they're committing have changed a little bit, but we did. Generally, the political stalwarts, too many of them, just haven't learned anything as to right from wrong. But circumstances, Herodotus was the 5th century historian called the father of history. And he has recorded an interesting statement that fits in with what I experienced. And that he wrote and said, and this is in the 5th century, "Circumstances rule men. Men do not rule circumstances." And how true that is, because the circumstances of the committee and of my group that led up to the discovery of the tapes was pure circumstance. It was reported that by Time magazine, when it happened, that it was the result of a throwaway question by the committee. It was not a result of a throwaway question for 2 reasons. And one of the reasons was that when we interviewed John Dean, John was talking about his recollections of talking with the president in the Oval Office and what they discussed. He made the statement that I got the feeling the president was asking me leading questions, yes or no, not like he was having a normal discussion, but he wanted a definite answer out of me. And Dean said, I kind of felt like I was being recorded. Well, that was Dean's speculation, but it hit with my minority counsel and me from that interview that, well, maybe he was being recorded. That does sound strange. That was about a month before the ultimate interview. And then in the meantime, I had subpoenaed from the White House staff, I wanted a copy of Nixon's calendar, and I wanted to know, for about 18-month period, I wanted to know who he met with, and when they met, who was in the room, how long it lasted. I knew from our study of Nixon's habits, he was not a prolific note taker at all, like some like Reagan. He didn't keep a daily diary, didn't keep records. So I got the information. Fred Buzzard, a good lawyer from South Carolina, had moved into the White House, and so Fred complied with the subpoena and delivered that information to me. And there was the calendar with the dates and the names of the people, how long the conversation lasted, just what I was looking for a little background. But at the bottom of each entry, there was a summary of what the discussion was about. And knowing that Nixon didn't keep notes, and that his office technique was the daily news report, he would get it, and he would write in the margin the initial of his staff member that he would want to follow up on that particular item that was newsworthy. And the thought came to me, nothing brilliant about it, was how on earth did they know what those discussions were going back 12, 14, 18 months. And based on those two things, the suspicion was there that something was going on that enabled Dean to wonder if he was being recorded. And I was thinking in terms of a little Radio Shack recorder or something like, well, they didn't have this small back then, but just a little device that Nixon could hide somewhere. And so when the time came, the question was asked. It was not a throwaway question. It was the result of some good basic investigation that Don Sanders, my minority co-counsel, and I had gathered. And I had a note here to remind you all at first about the proposition in physics that physics experts tell us that light travels faster than sound. I know you all heard this. That is also why some people appear bright until you hear them speak. Whether that's going to apply, I'll leave that up to you. But we did, it was a mechanical, thought-out process that led to the Friday the 13th, July the 13th, the day after my birthday, when I was planning to come home to the family party that Friday night. I commuted every day, every week, and Butterfield was in the room, and the investigator was Scott Armstrong. You may remember that name. Scott teamed up with Bob Woodard and wrote the book The Brethren about the U.S. Supreme Court later on. He and Woodard, the Washington Post reporter, lived in the same building. We had leaks coming out of our ears and nose and all the pores and every orifice of the body, and it was really we just never knew what was going to be in the paper the next day. But Scott never asked the question about recording. He talked for 2.5 hours. The system was investigator asked first because he was the most knowledgeable on the scene person. The minority counsel went second, and I, as the majority counsel, was supposed to ask everything that was left out, bring up the rear on it. And Scott, 2.5 hours, never mentioned it. Well, Don and I, who had worked together and talked together, when his time came, it was really not a question. as such. And he had difficulty phrasing. He didn't want to be blunt about it, like, what are you people doing in the Oval? Are you secretly bugging? He didn't want to use words like bugging somebody. He was polite about it. He said, Mr. Butterfield, is there anything to what we've been hearing about the possible recording in the Oval Office? That was all that was said. One question. Don asked follow-up. I asked a lot of follow-ups, but the one question that opened the door. Butterfield said, White House counsel told me y'all might ask about this and told me that I'd have to tell the truth. And yes, you are under oath and you better tell the truth. And so he spilled the whole thing. He talked about the taping system in the Oval Office, the taping system in the Cabinet Room in the Executive Building. And he finally got around to the fifth place, I think it was. He said, yes, we have a locator system that we know where the president is at all times with a screen, and there's a recording device in each of these places. And the last place he mentioned was the Aspen cabin at Camp David. Well, at the time, that probably didn't ring a bell now, but at the time, there being a taping system in the Aspen cabin at Camp David was where the foreign dignitaries were housed when they came to Washington on a visit. 4 months prior to that, Leonid Brezhnev, the premier of Russia, had come to visit. The Cold War had warmed up a little bit, and Brezhnev came over and he stayed in the Aspen cabin. My first reaction to that was, oh my God, World War III is upon us. We have secretly taped the premier of the Soviet Union. Butterfield assured us, said, no, when we have a visitor there, we take the system out. And I thought, I hope to God you're telling the truth now. And it never did develop into any kind of a problem. So the matter of the tapes came out, and I was going home to my birthday party late by then. Butterfield was on his way to Moscow. He'd become head of the FAA, and he wanted to get it done quickly or else postpone it. But when we reported it to Senator Irvin and Senator Baker, they said, no, there's not going to be any postponement. We're going with the testimony on Monday. And so we proceeded with that plan. And because of all the leaks, everybody was under pressure as to who was leaking. You remember the Deep Throat episode, the guy that met the reporters over in the parking garage in D.C. and gave them the inside story of what was going on. Turned out to be the deputy director of the FBI was leaking information at 2 o'clock in the morning to the Washington Post at night. Mark Felt, who later, before he died, a year or two before he died, when he was very, very poor health, he finally fessed up that he was Deep Throat. Anyway, the leaks were a problem, and that was all on my mind. I had to report to the majority counsel, Sam Dash, and the Senator and Baker what we had discovered, because it looked like a pretty doggone big deal. But my concern was, oh Lord, what if a leak comes out through the Raleigh News and Observer or the Raleigh Times? Who's going to get the blame for it? Lacey Presnell, who's now an attorney in Raleigh, some of you know, was a young investigator right out of college. He was on my staff, and Lacey rode back to Raleigh with me, and I couldn't tell anybody. I was scared to death. I told Pat when I got home, but didn't even tell the children or anybody else. I got up Saturday morning in Raleigh after the birthday party that night, went to the newsstand, bought a Washington Post. No story about the tapes. No story about the Butterfield revelation. I was relieved. Sunday morning, got up and did the same thing. No story in the Washington Post. It was perfectly clean. So still no disclosure. So I headed back to Washington Monday morning, about 5 o'clock in the morning, left, and got up there about 9 o'clock. You could go a little faster back then. We went straight to the office and got a copy of the Washington Post on Monday morning, July the 16th, after Friday the 13th. I was so happy there's not a word about the tapes Monday morning. I was so relieved. It had not leaked out, and by then I was back in Washington, so I couldn't get the blame for it. I had my little briefcase. I went to my office and was walking down to the caucus room where we were holding the hearings. I looked up, and there was a group of reporters that had one of the staff members cornered right down the hall, and I could tell they were all over him, and it was people you came to know later on: Dan Rather, Dan Shore, Dick Cavett, Connie Chung, some of those names that later they were just reporters on the scene at the time. They saw me coming down the hall. They left whoever it was. They came tearing up my way, and they got a few feet away. And I said, "Good morning." And I was going to walk on down to the caucus room, and I'm pretty sure it was kind of church. She said, "Well, Boyce said, you know something. What's going on?" The schedule had changed on the TV schedule. That for that Monday, they'd shifted some witnesses around, put Butterfield on, and postponed some others. They knew something was going on. I said, "Good morning." They said, "Boyce, you know what's going. You look like you know something. What's going on?" I said, "When I told you good morning, I told you everything I know." If you'll excuse the language, one of them, the responsible one of them was a smart-ass Southerner. And I guess I was, but anyway, it went on, and then that day, the information about the tapes, only 27 pages, an 11-volume transcript of the hearings made up the testimony of Alexander Butterfield, that by quite a series of coincidences resulted in the resignation of the President of the United States. The next day, I went to get the Post again, and thank goodness, on Tuesday, July the 17th, it was revealed to the world that Nixon had been recording. A lot of people's first reaction, and frankly mine was, well, that slick devil, he is going to get off the hook because those tapes will tell the truth. When I was first hired and interviewed by Sam Dash for the job, he asked me the question. We were at the Carroll Arms having lunch, and he was interviewing me. He said, "Gene, you have any problem if our investigation goes all the way to the top?" And of course, my response was, "I'll go wherever the truth goes, Sam. I'll follow the truth wherever it goes." And so the truth did go to the very top. And some other people had that same reaction too. They thought that having the tapes and having exactly what went on would prove Nixon everything he'd been saying, which was a little bit too much in his own defense, whether it was true or not. That turned out to be a pretty bad prognostication on my part. The information that was on the tapes, first they revealed some of the information from the tapes was typed up, and they revealed it in writing and in print to the world, to the news media, and to the committee. It was a rather selective process of revelation that they did reveal. But as you all remember or you have read, it proved that there was indeed knowledge about the break-in, mainly focusing on the cover-up of the truth about it, and focusing on the fact that the White House tried to get the FBI off the case by getting the CIA to tell the FBI that it was a matter of national security and there should be no revelations. Well, all of that hanky-panky stuff was revealed in the actual tape recordings. Then there was the famous 18.5-minute gap in the tape. You remember one of the tapes had 18 minutes that had apparently been erased, and Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Wood, tried to demonstrate to the press how she accidentally erased it, and they had pictures of it. In such a contorted mode that no way it could have been erased like that. And to illustrate how very historical and important all these events were, I went on the internet last night and just Googled in the word. There's still a controversy going on about these tapes. As of this past spring, they have experts that are still examining those tapes, trying to get information that has been erased back into audible form. They've also still investigating. Haldeman submitted a document in which he wrote down his recollection, and that document is still on file at the appropriate place in Washington. And somebody got those papers, 2 sheets of paper. Nobody here in 37 years had ever raised this question, but this particular individual looked at those papers where Haldeman told about at the smoking gun tape. You remember the smoking gun incident where it was proof within 3 days after the break-in that Nixon and Haldeman and Ehrlichman knew the break-in was going on, knew that money was coming from the Republican committee to support the break-in and the burglars. Holloman wrote a 2-page report, and this guy that examined it within the past 6 months. The first page is about the first part of the smoking gun conversation, the 18-minute gap tape. The second page is about how they concluded it. And the question was, well, that's a mighty short summary. How about in between? And it's reported that I found out last night, the person who looked at those 2 pieces of paper looked at them very carefully that nobody else had done before. And instead of 2 staple holes where papers were stapled together, there were 2 sets of staple holes, which meant something, this document has been separated and restapled. And the question was, where are the missing pages? So they're working on that now, so you may still continue to be bored about Watergate and the tapes, but it's still going on. I would really enjoy answering your questions if you have any. If anybody has to leave, it won't be embarrassing to me for you to take off. But I would very much like to entertain any questions you have. I have a copy of the President's letter of resignation. I have one thing that's happened afterwards was the use of the term gate. Every time we have a political scandal, it ends in the word gate. And you will not believe the collection of gate circumstances that there are of political happenings and other things. My favorite of all is Shouldergate. Anybody ever heard of Shouldergate? In 1985, the Pittsburgh Steelers, in their spring practice, made the mistake of wearing shoulder pads, which was prohibited by the NFL rules. And they found out, a reporter reported it and thought it was quite innocent. And the Steelers lost their draft pick because some of the players at spring practice wore shoulder pads. And that was Shouldergate. But then there was the Hillary Clinton, all those things, a whole lot of things that happened. Now, if you hear the last term ending in gate, you know it has something to do with political or some kind of shenanigans or violation of rules. I've got a lot of stuff left over. My favorite one is what appeared in the Detroit Free Press about the Watergate panel bugged by trivia computer called in. And the reason I like this, Marilyn, I want you to look at it close. Look at the hair I had back then. Isn't that great? Can you believe it? Pat remembers. She has a little memory of the hair. The circumstance of ending up with Butterfield as my witness was quite a circumstance, because this is a copy of the Nixon White House staff that were witnesses. This is a copy of the first 6 months of the campaign committee. This is the list of the people involved in the second 6 months of the campaign, and that is a list of the finance committee that was very much involved in the break-in and shoveling money to Barker and the Cubans. They traced checks, political checks that were made out to the committee and endorsed over to the burglars. That was not a good way to commit criminal acts by endorsing checks like that. But I appreciate questions, and if anybody has to leave, I don't want to take up your time.
Was there a young lawyer, woman who sort of gained her first prominence there, Hillary Rodham? Was she involved with the committee?
Yes. Hillary was over on the House side during the impeachment proceedings. When my tenure was up and I wanted to get back home, the impeachment followed my tenure there, and that was over on the House side. And they did have a impeachment drawn, and they had voted on the first article of impeachment, and Hillary was very much involved in the House committee that was handling that. And yeah, John.
You said that you had an expectation about the implications of the tapes didn't turn out to be what actually happened. You thought maybe you could exonerate Nixon, but it didn't make sense enough to keep his story consistent with what was reported. Can you tell
Well, he and Senator Baker worked extremely well together. They were that was probably the best political conglomeration or pairing up that history has known. My recollection is that well, Senator Erwin, far from being born yesterday. I mean, he had so much insight about politics, about law, about the Constitution, about everything. My sense and recollection is he from his experience and his background, he knew that it was wrong from the beginning. And there was a sense that, well, Nixon didn't plan it, but there was no question in his mind about the cover-up. You remember the primary question that Senator Baker raised is, what did the president know and when did he know it? That was the focus. And there was very little doubt, I think, John, by any of the senators or the staff that Nixon was involved in the cover-up aspect of it. The degree to which he was involved was thought to be perhaps somewhat innocent, but the way it turned out, I remember my mother and father and my mother and father-in-law. They were fine people, and they were shocked when they heard the tapes that were released, when they heard the president's language that they used in the back room. My parents and Pat's parents and the older group who were a bit more conservative than we, and a whole heck of a lot more conservative than today, thought that was just terrible. That anybody who used that kind of language did not deserve to be president of the United States. And now you hear it when you flip on television. Yeah.
Is there any indication in his earlier years of how he came through politics that there was that tendency or anything? Because a lot of times with politicians, when they end up in something like that, there's been precursors beforehand.
My sense and what I've read and what I've heard, there's a lot of that. Politics had been very tough. Nixon, you remember he said when he was a governor of California and he got in, and he'd always had problems with the press, you won't have Richard Nixon to pick on anymore. Oh, yes, they did. It was very antagonistic back then. And the Democrats were, they didn't face people like Senator Baker. They didn't get caught, in other words. There was a lot of that sort of stuff going on. And to some extent, it's still shenanigans here and there. But I think Nixon had toughened. He was really, in fact, one of the tapes said after the break-in, when he was talking about how to try to use the CIA to tell the FBI to get the heck out of town, quit. That was based on the Bay of Pigs controversy, where they thought the CIA was involved in the Bay of Pigs, which had to do with assassination of the Cuban prime minister, and all of that was going on at that time. So they were using that as a means of cover-up. But the Nixon had been involved in it, and the Pentagon Papers had already occurred, but he was fighting back. To hear some of the things he said, he was getting even. They do it to us, we're going to do it to them. There's a lot of that back and forth in the conversation. And the Ellsberg break at the Pentagon Papers, they said, well, that was okay for the Ellsberg to reveal the papers. He had the right to blow the whistle. And my sense of that is Ellsberg didn't blow the whistle, he stole the whistle. There's a big difference between blowing a whistle and stealing the thing. But it was very much a reaction by him to what had been going on before. Yeah.
Do you have any insight as to why? I mean, Nixon's just going to, he was running against McGovern. He was going to cream him anyway. I mean, why take these kinds of risks? Was he just a crazy paranoid?
I'm glad you've asked that, because that brings out a very important historical fact of the election. Nixon, he had it in the bag. He had it in. McGovern was goofing off, messed up the campaign, and messed up in his speeches. He had Eagleton for 2 weeks after the convention. Do y'all remember who came in fourth in the Democratic nomination for president in 1972? Terry Sanford. Terry Sanford. Yeah. Anyway, Richard Nixon went on to win the election after messing up in June with burglars and all that sort of stuff. He went on to win the election in November, 520 electoral votes to 17 for McGovern. He even carried McGovern's home state of South Dakota, carried North Carolina 70 to 30%. Nixon had 520, McGovern had only 17 electoral votes. He had Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. Is all he had. And there was a third, anybody remember the third candidate? John Hospers, Libertarian candidate from California, had one vote, had one electoral vote.
What was his name?
John Hospers.
No.
Oh, he was a representative. He was a Republican from Virginia. That what was his name?
Roger McBride.
Roger McBride. I'll have to make a note of that. Yeah, one guy switched over and voted for Hospers. I've still got, that's my little desk memo note I wrote to myself, scheduling the Butterfield interview. We had it scheduled for the morning, and he was going to Moscow, so he wanted to postpone it, so I let him postpone it. Then when we found out about the tapes, we made him postpone it a few more days until he testified the following Monday. And so, yes.
Mind explaining the major mistake that Nixon made in firing his attorney, John Dean?
The what did he make?
The major mistake that he made in firing.
Oh, yeah, that was strange. He let Haldeman and Ehrlichman, his two assistants, resign, but he fired Dean in April. Well, as soon as he fired Dean, Dean was over in our office talking a whole lot. It was probably, I don't know why he didn't let Dean resign, why he fired him. Maybe Dean refused to resign. I never did hear the rest of that, but in any way, it was a major mistake. And he had the same thing on the special prosecutor side, where his appointee would not fire the prosecutor. So he appointed he fired him and appointed somebody else who would fire. And incidentally, the one he did appoint that ultimately did do the firing of the guy that Nixon wanted out was a man by the name of Robert Bork, who tried to get on the Supreme Court, but he didn't make it. And whether that made a difference or not, I would certainly speculate that it had something to do with it, yeah.
When you look at the way leaders used to be treated by the press, by opponents, by anybody writing stories, as opposed to how they're treated now, what do you think about that? Is it a good thing? Is it really different?
Well, my reaction, like I told Sam Dash when he asked me if coming on the committee, would I have any problem if the investigation went to the top? And I said, I'll follow the truth wherever it goes. And I think that's what we all should lean toward, whatever the truth is. And if it hadn't been for the press, some of this list of things, local things that happened in the recent past, would never have come to pass. So as far as the press doing their job, and Don Carrington, people like that, we need them and need them bad. They're the ones that dig, and they dig for the truth. They're not interested in publishing lies. They want to know the truth, just like the rest of us are entitled to. So, yeah, I'm all for that. That's why it's so important for all of us to contribute to the John Locke Society and the Carolina Journal. If I put in the plug, I wasn't told to do that, but I will throw that in.